I guess we shall move on. Before we go for our morning break, we have Jeffrey Werner
Thank
to
you.
talk about. Yeah, thank you guys. Yeah, to talk about how telematics can deliver a better product for consumers in terms of claims handling, bad driving behavior, fairer premiums. Jeff Werner is the managing member of Werner Advisory and is an insurance pricing expert. He co-authored the text that CAS uses to teach rate making to all actuarial candidates. During his career, he has been on the forefront of insurance innovation, being an earlier pioneer in predictive modeling and telematics. Jeff?
Thank you. Can you see my screen fine?
Yes, can see.
Awesome. Okay, well, I'm delighted to be speaking to this group today. I'm going to talk about telematics, and I'm really going to do it trying to focus in on the consumer and what's in it for the consumer. As I start this, I want to step back and say what does the consumer really want, and I'm going to look at it from a few different angles. One is from a product. You can see by my beard, I've been in the industry for quite some time. When I started, all of the auto insurance products, personal lines, were pretty much the same. There was no difference other than maybe the price in it. And certainly we know that consumers by and large are getting much more demanding and expect things to be tailored, and insurance is no different. And so we'll talk a little bit about how telematics allows that. From a pricing perspective, I mean, clearly from a pricing perspective, we all want our auto insurance to be as cheap as possible, but I think there are other things that we care about. I think transparency is a big deal. We want to understand why we're being charged what we are. We want, we're okay with paying something, but we want to make sure we're being charged fairly. And if at all possible, we'd like to have some control over what we're being charged. On the claims perspective, when we have an event, we just want to get back to normal as quickly as possible. We don't want a lot of hassle associated with it. And clearly we all want to be safe. So I'm going to talk about telematics from each of these perspectives and how it can help meet what the consumer is wanting. For those of you maybe that don't know what telematics is, I'm just going to put a very simple graphic up here to kind of explain it. Generally, when we talk about telematics, there's kind of three parties involved. One is the consumer, one is the insurer, and there's usually someone else involved that's collecting the data. It could be an auto manufacturer, a telematic service provider, but somebody that's collecting the data and providing some of the services. The consumer, basically, if they don't have a connected car already, they're going to be provided with some sensor. Those sensors could be just an app that they'll put on their phone. It might be an OBD device they slide into the diagnostic port, or it could be an app and a tag. Those are the most common, but there are a full range of technology solutions, and it kind of depends on what part of the world you're in, which one might be most prevalent. Once that sensor is present, the car, even if it wasn't connected before, essentially starts to behave a little bit like a connected vehicle. The data is collected and then services are provided. And there's a wide range of services that could be provided if we're able to get that data. So that's very simply what telematics-based insurance is. So let's go to those four things and talk about from the consumer perspective. And we think about product. And I always like when I go into insurance companies, I love talking to the product manager or marketing, because I think telematics is something that's a dream come true for them. And to kind of illustrate, I just picked four types of people. It's four different customers. There's a full range of them, but I picked four. Number one is going to be, I'm going to call them a remote worker Ronnie. This is somebody that maybe had 3 vehicles. COVID hit, now all of a sudden is more of a remote worker, and those vehicles are sitting in the garage and not being driven as much as they were before. I'm going to also focus in a little bit on cautious Calvin. I know that I don't mean this really in terms of from the COVID perspective, but it's just a good graphic to show that he's cautious. This is somebody that drives very safely. It doesn't speed a lot, very smooth driver. Cynical Cyrus. So this might be somebody who doesn't really trust the insurance companies a whole lot and really thinks that the way that we do our pricing and determine it might not be fair. A great example of that in the United States would be we use insurance credit scores, and people don't like that at all. And the fourth person I'll say is Hopeless Holly. Hopeless Holly is a parent who just got a teen driver and doesn't think that their teen driver is ever going to be able to drive responsibly. So if you think about these different customers, all with different needs, how can telematics help? And I pulled some examples of some companies and how they're promoting their product and marketing to the needs of these people. So for remote worker Ronnie, probably wants to have something that reflects the fact that he's not driving nearly as much. So Nobler, a company, a startup that was recently bought by USAA, you can see their ad. It's drive less and you save more. That's what's really prominent, is a pay per mile type program that you're only paying for the miles that you drive. So it's very good for him. For Cautious Cow, who drives very safely. State Farm, their whole program, in fact, it's called Drive Safe and Save. So their whole thing is, if you're a safe driver, you can get up to a 30% discount on our insurance. For Cynical Cyrus, a company that was recently launched called Loop, is all about, and you see it, it's about honest, it's all about honest pricing, and they actually say no credit check. So they're not using insurance credit scoring where most of the insurance companies in the United States would be doing that. And they talk a lot about in different articles, but in the one that I pulled, that car insurance rates are biased to have, in this case, systemic racism associated with them. And they believe, using telematics and other things they're doing, that they're removing the bias out of it. And the final one that I mentioned was Hopeless Holly, the parent who's got a teen driver. This is just an example from American Family Insurance, who has a safe driver discount program. If you read in the small text, it talks about that they monitor for distracted driving and other risky behaviors to try to help promote safer driving for the teens. So these are just a smattering of some of the different programs. And we see this a lot. Originally all of the programs look kind of the same, but now we're seeing insurance companies take telematics and have different products to try to excite a certain customer segment. So it really is a product manager's dream. It's great for the consumers. From a pricing perspective, Velda had said, I'm an actuary that has focused a lot on rate making, so pricing is near and dear to my heart. As we think about it from the consumer perspective, I said earlier, what do consumers want? They want something that's fair. They want to understand it. They want it to be transparent, and if at all possible, they want it to be controllable. And so I pulled up this graphic. When I usually talk about telematics, I'm always talking about what telematics is great about is it tells us how much, when, and where a vehicle is actually operating. So it gives us the telematics data that allows us to measure all of those things very directly. So we haven't had telematics forever. Before that, we used traditional variables, and many of the traditional variables were what I would say would be proxies for one of these four quadrants. There are other things that also matter, like what kind of vehicle you're driving, but how much, when, and where do have a big impact on what we're going to be charged. So let's compare some of these. So if we wanted to think about what we use today that gets at how you drive, I'd say driving record is a big one, right? So traditional variable, we would use driving record. How many accidents have you had? How many convictions, speeding tickets have you had? Things like age, sex, and marital status. We tend to think that youthful drivers, particularly youthful male drivers, drive more aggressively, less safely. Credit score, which probably has a lot of different impacts, but credit score is about financial irresponsibility. Maybe that also plays into driving irresponsibly. Again, all of these things are proxies for how you drive. And I'll use the example of age. Just because you're 18 years old doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad driver, and you don't become a better driver when you go from 18 to 19. It's a proxy. On average, those drivers are risky. But when we have telematics data, what are the kinds of things we can see? We can look at the individual driver, the operator of that vehicle, and we can measure, are they distracted driving or not? Not whether they got a ticket for it, but we know at all times whether they're engaging in distracted driving. We also can study things like how fast they're going, how aggressively they're braking, do they go around corners safely, and things like acceleration. Does their car always look like it's in cruise control, or are they really speeding up and slowing down in a very aggressive manner? All those are directly measuring how we drive. In terms of how much we drive, some of the traditional variables we would look at, some companies will ask people how much you drive, so you'll get an estimated mileage in a traditional plan. They might look at how many cars, how many vehicles you have in the household versus how many drivers there are to operate them. There'll also be things like a principal operator versus occasional operator, which is commonly used for youthfuls. And there are some other examples like away at school type things. Again, these are all things that are trying to get at how much the vehicle is being operated. But when we have telematics, we know exactly how much the vehicle is being operated. So we have the actual mileage. We also can look at other things like average trip length. Is it riskier to take small, short trips, or after a certain amount of time, maybe you become fatigued? Also, maybe how many trips you take in a day, all getting at how much you drive. When we think about when you drive, it's a little harder to think about the traditional variables that get at when you drive. I pulled three that I thought could be proxies for that. One would be usage. Some insurance companies still have a different rate for like pleasure use versus drive to work versus business use. You would certainly think that drive to work and business would be predominantly driving during normal work hours, but not exclusively. I put age and marital status. You would think that, I'm in my 50s and married. I'm probably not out driving at 2 a.m. at the bars. When you're 21 years old and single, maybe that's more prevalent. So there might be an aspect of when. But if we have telematics, again, we don't have to guess. We know exactly when that vehicle is being operated, both the time of day as well as the day of week. We can also get some inferences on congestion. So when we talk about traditional, we might be looking at something like drive to work, thinking they're going during rush hour. We can kind of measure that. We can also actually get information on the weather that was occurring at the time they were driving. And then where, the big one for where in traditional would be, where is the car, what is your address? Where's the car parked? Probably a good indication and heavily correlated with where you drive. But with telematics, we know exactly where you're driving, and we can get things like the road type. Is it a very complex road, or is it just a highway with no on and off ramps, but maybe every few miles? We can look at accident hotspots. Are you driving through a place where there are notoriously a lot of accidents? And maybe even things like the familiarity. Do you drive this road often? So all of these telematics things are great because they are actually causal variables. We know they're happening, and these things do lead to most of them are causal, lead to an accident or increased or decreased risk. They're certainly also easier to understand for the consumer. I can understand why, if I'm distracted driving, I should be charged more, where in a traditional, I'm not sure that I understand why, because my insurance credit score was higher, that I should be charged more. And in some of these cases, it's actually controllable as well. I can stop distracted driving and cut that down and potentially get a better rate. People always ask, how powerful is the data? And the simple answer is it's incredibly powerful. I got this from Octo Telematics. So this is the drivability score. So what was done here, these are 10,000 risks were scored, and And these are 10 different buckets. So all the risks were scored and then put in order, with the safest one being in number one, and the riskiest one being 10,000. And then they were divided into 10 equal groups. So the first 1,000 are in bucket one, the second 1,000 are in bucket two, the whole way through 10, with the safest one being decile 1, the riskiest being decile 10. The yellow line shows the relative risk, measuring both frequency and severity. The difference between 10 and 1, it's 10 is about somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 13 times higher than number 1. So it's a huge difference. To put that in context, if you were looking at traditional variables like class plan, age, sex, marital status, that would probably be more of a factor of 3. So this is on order of magnitude 3 or 4 times more powerful than the traditional variables that are largely proxies for this actual data. Now I say that, and I say proxies, so a lot of times people wonder, well, how good are the proxies? And am I just implementing an expensive program, a telematics program, and I'm really not going to get any additional opportunity in pricing segmentation? And so what this chart shows is I've thrown onto the same chart the average premium that the insurance company would have charged those risks if they didn't have the telematics data, and that's the gray. So if we look at the bar number 1, so the 1,000 of the safest, this is the average premium that would be charged if we didn't have telematics data, and this is what they should be charged once we know that they're in this category. You can see I've over on the right side, I've put what the difference is. So this is 70% below what they were being charged. If we go over to the right side, I see what they should be charged is way higher than what they would be charged using traditional traditional factors. In fact, it's about twice as high. Their rate should be about double. If we look at across the spectrum, you can see that in all cases, with the exception of 7, where it crosses, there's double-digit opportunity for better pricing. So there's significant segmentation power in telematics, and also it's the whole way through the spectrum here. So from a consumer point of view, I guess if you're a consumer and you're 9 and 10, this isn't such a great deal because you should be charged more and might have some surcharges. But for the majority of the risks, if we were using telematics data, they would be able to show or prove that they deserve a lower rate. And hopefully the people in 9 and 10 could 8, 9, and 10 could improve their driving and bring their premium down. So let's turn to the claims aspect of it. So I said before, claims, what do we want? We want a quick resolution. We want to be made whole as fast as possible. And I'll tell you, I recently had a claim. I'm an insurance professional. I understand what my obligations are when I do get into an accident. But even me, as I had the accident, I knew I needed to figure out where I was and what time it was that it occurred, but I didn't do the greatest job of figuring that out. And when I called my insurance company, who's a very good insurance company, I started getting asked all kinds of questions. And, it was like, well, I think it was about 6:15 and it was close to this corner. And then they started asking me questions about how fast everyone was going. And again, even me, who was somebody that's an insurance professional, I struggled to answer all of their questions. And I had to have repeated conversations. Well, think about what telematics can do for us. In this, I pulled up a graphic from Cambridge Mobile Telematics, and this is part of their Claim Studio product. And so when they detect a crash is going to happen, they populate a bunch of information. And so this is all information that was not gathered from the customer, but was gathered from the data that they collected through the sensors. And so I'm not going to read through everything, but if you look at the crash description, it talks about which way they were traveling, where exactly it happened, what time it was. They even go to, look at what the weather was like at that time. They can look at the accelerometer data, and they can estimate what kind of severity happened, and even what part of the car was likely impacted. So this is all information that is pre-populated. I don't even have to call the insurance company to even inform them that this happened. It's already there. And when I do have the discussion with them, it's more me validating what happened rather than me having to regurgitate things that I may or may not remember. And this data is really important. And you think about what could we do with this if we were an insurance company? So first, we can detect a crash happen. So I wouldn't even have had to pick up the phone to tell my insurance company that a crash happened, but rather they could have been notified based on the data. And depending on the severity of it, they could have asked me if I needed help. So my insurance company could have looked like a hero by saying, do you need an ambulance to come help you? That was a pretty severe crash. Do you want us to call someone? Or maybe they want to call a tow truck because they know that the damage is going to be so severe. In terms of the settlement of it, they can go into claims triage. Using that information, they can decide what kind of claim was it. If it was severe enough and it was a total damage loss, they could just pay out the cost of the vehicle right then without having me have to see an adjuster. If it was a relatively simple claim, it's obviously low impact. Maybe I even bumped into something in a parking lot that wasn't even another vehicle, it was single vehicle. They could just fast track it, send it to a claims adjuster who's just going to get it paid rather quickly. Maybe a claims adjuster that doesn't have a ton of experience even could handle this. They could also look at the data and maybe see that it was multiple kind of collisions. Think about maybe if somebody rear-ended me and it pushed me into another vehicle, that would show up as two collisions for me, one me getting hit and one me hitting someone ahead of me. The insurance company would know that's going to be a really difficult one for the adjustment. It could be a lot of he said, she said. And so they might send that to a more complex, somebody that's able to handle more complex claims because they know it's going to be a problem. All of these things, if they push me into the right direction and get me the help when I need, or when I'm needed, it gives me a much better experience and should be able to speed me through the entire process. So crashing claims is something that, I think Italy was one with telematics where they were using it for this use case pretty early on, and the rest of the world was not. We're starting to see a lot more interest in companies utilizing this data. In fact, I saw the other day, I believe it was Farmers was advertising their ability to send help when you need it. So I think you'll see a lot more emphasis on this going forward. And the fourth section that I wanted to talk about from a consumer perspective is safer driving. How can we utilize this information to actually make people safer and hopefully reduce the accidents? So no bad events would be the ideal. And I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes with this. I'm gonna start with the one on right, which is my father got into one of these programs, and the program would measure his behavior on several dimensions, one of which was harsh braking. And he called me one day and he was really excited because he was getting a cheaper premium. And I said, well, that's really great. How did you do that? And he said, well, I've reduced my harsh brakes. And I said, well, that's exciting. How did you do that? And he said, well, I don't stop when the light's turning from yellow to red, I don't stop anymore. I just blow through the light. And I thought, wow, okay. This company actually just made him a worse driver and made him less safe. And so there's an anecdote of we have to be really careful what we tell them. We need to focus on behaviors that actually cause accidents to happen. They should have been focusing more on things like, are you following too closely? Are you maybe going too fast as you approach lights in his case? Maybe distracted driving might cause a harsh brake, but this will play into my next slide. So there's an example of he changed his behavior and actually became less safe. An anecdote about my son, when I started this telematics, my son was just turning 16 years old. And this chart represents basically his first year of driving. And he was a guinea pig for me. For anything I wanted to try, I always put it in a vehicle that he was going to be operating. And this was some technology that was done by Green Road Technology that focused in on fleet drivers. And they allowed me to utilize their product. Green was good, yellow is average, and red is bad. And so the higher the score, the worse you are as a driver. Remember, this is a fleet product, so my son, a 16-year-old, was being compared against fleet drivers. When you look at the solid bit here, this was right when we started the program. He was getting information sent to him about his driving. I was getting information. He knew how I was driving versus him, so there was competition going on, lots of information. And frankly, I was pretty satisfied that he was in the yellow category, given that he was competing against professional drivers. When it turns from solid to dotted line is when the Green Road decided to focus in on only commercial and wasn't going to do the personal line. So they allowed me to keep the service in the car and continue to track, but they stopped giving me all of the information on a regular basis. So if I wanted to see how, or my son wanted to see how he was doing, or I wanted to see how he was doing, I had to go into a website, log in and look at it, and then we would talk about it. But I wasn't getting immediate feedback from Green Road at that point. And that went on for about a year. And that's this dotted line area. When we get over to here, I happened to be in a presentation much like this one, and somebody asked me, what kind of information can you see? And I said, oh, you know what? Let me pull up a website that I have with information on my son. And so in front of an audience, I pulled up his portal. And when you pull up the portal, I had to piece all of this together. When you pull up the portal, you only see about 5 weeks of driving behavior. So I basically saw this over here. And remember, the last time I looked at it, it looked like this. So I was really upset. I had to compose myself and finish the presentation. I happened to be in Europe, and it happened to be a morning in Europe, and my son was sleeping in Texas. So I had to wait for a few hours until he was up and scold him and say, driving is a right, it's not a right, it's a privilege. And told him from that point on, we were going to really go back to focusing on it. And I made a very concerted effort to share information with them. And that's where you see it got better again. I bring these two anecdotes up because when we talk about behavior change and trying to build programs for consumers, I think we need to think of three pillars. One is we need to identify things that cause accidents to happen. So make sure, if we're going to change a behavior, make sure we're changing a behavior that will result in fewer accidents. That's what went wrong with my stepfather. They changed something that didn't make him safer. And two, we have to communicate the information in a way people can understand it. That's what went wrong with my son. He wasn't getting the information in a timely fashion in that middle section. And three, we have to make sure we're providing the right incentives to change. And so those were anecdotes in it, but I did want to, this is a real South African company that did this, that has a program. They instituted a behavior change program. They used concepts like hyperbolic discounting, so very smaller rewards, setting goals for people, made sure they were continuously engaged, and used a lot of loss aversion. People don't want to lose they're more worried about losing something they have than actually gaining something new. They used those concepts and had very good results. What this is showing is this is the amount of behavior change they were able to achieve. So 0 to 100 is positive behavior change. These are like points. So the further the right, the better the person changed their behavior. To the left, it means they got worse. And this was the change in claims frequency. And you can see the change in claims frequency for those who really improved went down drastically. If we go the other end of the spectrum, they got worse. It really played played out. So they're very successful in this, and the consumers love it, right? They're being kept safer. So some final thoughts. I started this by saying, what did the consumer want? I think, I'm talking to, a lot of actuaries here. I think we should also think about, what does the insurer get? This really is a win-win proposition in it. By making products that are more tailored, that should increase your growth and retention rates. By having, for the consumer, something that's more understandable and fair and controllable for them, that's going to make them happy. But the pricing, as I showed you, it's incredibly accurate. So it's going to make your pricing and your segmentation much better, which will lead to better profitability. On the claims, I said the consumer just wants to be made whole fast. But as we speed up and when we stop having people have to call them repeatedly, or having to have a car towed to a salvage or towed to a house and then towed to the garage, all of those things will result in reductions of loss and loss adjustment expense, which is clearly good for the insurer. And the safety, to the extent that we're keeping people from having accidents from happening, that's also going to result in reduction in loss in LAE. And I'll leave you with 5 things for you to ponder if you're thinking about telematics. These are, each of these things could be a whole session. The first one is technology selection. I get asked all the time, what technology should I use? And the answer to that question is, the technology you should use to collect the data really depends on what you're trying to accomplish. Just make sure you understand what the pros and cons are of the technological solution, and make sure they're going to meet your needs. On the analytics, if you want to start analyzing telematics data, if you're going to collect it, you need to understand it's not like traditional data. The data, there's a lot more of it. It's a lot more complex. And so if you're going to be analyzing it, you're going to need to have new infrastructure, you have new analytical tools and techniques, and some resources that you might not have had before. As you're building these products, you should realize consumer behavior. You can't always predict what's going to happen. And I don't mean driving behavior. I mean, will they actually download the app and give you the right permissions? There are all kinds of operational things like that you need to consider. So you should always hope for the best, but you should put things in play so that you can handle those, what I'll call rainy day scenarios. In terms of to get the most value out of this, I talked about different ways we can use telematics data. To maximize your value as an insurer is to implement multiple of those use cases. It might be hard to do all that at the beginning, but I would highly encourage a roadmap that would bring each of those in. And then finally, think about the evolution of telematics. It's relatively new in terms of its application to insurance. Things are always changing. Regulation in particular is going to catch up to where we are. And so you need to really be flexible, be nimble, and be looking for what's going on in the ecosystem to make sure you stay current. So that's it for me. So hopefully you have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you, Jeff, for that. Definitely could be a solution to our decision hygiene that was mentioned by Professor Sunstein to reduce the noise that we have in our pricing. We do have a lot of questions for you in terms of the cost, especially. For example, since it has gained ground in the US, all these premiums would increase for drivers not in telematic programs, and could there be a risk of a production gap and higher rates of uninsured drivers because their premiums are just going to be so unaffordable?
I'm not sure I understand. Which question is this on? I'm looking at the open questions.
Maybe we'll start with one then, because I was trying to combine Jimmy and Ronald's question in terms of with premiums increasing, there could be a risk of protection. What's your opinion of the risk of protection gap and the higher rates of uninsured drivers because of these?
Let me look at Jimmy's in first and kind of, because there's a lot to unpack in there. I mean, I think I think there's a lot of issues. I mean, it's certainly individual risk rating. I mean, I think that's a question that ultimately consumer groups are very worried about, right? And I think this is true not just in auto insurance. And there will at some point be, I mean, you have to decide: do you want individual risk rating or not? I mean, you don't have, as a family, you can't really do individual risk rating. I don't think we're anywhere close to that level. It's not the same thing as like in health insurance. If you had cancer or something of that matter. But I think that's going to be up for the regulators to decide how much of it do we want to use. I think that the regulators are going to really actually like this, in lieu of some of the things that they dislike about the proxy variables, because of the fact that it's controllable, makes more sense. So I think they will continue to embrace this. I use the example, particularly in the US, we have a lot of emphasis on systemic racism in policing. If you are concerned about that, you should be concerned that perhaps people of color are getting pulled over for tickets more. Well, we use speeding tickets in our pricing. Well, if we use the telematics data, we can see how often I'm speeding versus somebody else, maybe a person of color, but I'm not getting pulled over just because I'm white. So I think there are things like that are going to make this take off. I don't think we're anywhere close to the individual risk rating. The bigger question that I hear related to all of that stuff is, it's a voluntary program right now. So people start asking about privacy, and the easiest answer is, well, you don't have to get into one of these programs because it's voluntary. You can choose not to. Well, if all the good drivers go into a telematics and leave behind people who don't want to get into telematics or think that telematics is wrong for them, their premiums are going to go up because you're taking the good drivers. It's a selection issue. So you will see some of that.
Okay. Can these devices actually track if they run through a red light?
Most of the devices can't. There are devices that are utilizing cameras and things like that could do it. But most of the personal lines programs, from a cost perspective, are not checking that at this time.
Okay. I think there's one here about Asia. So we actually have a greater usage of scooters and motorcycles. Has telematics been developed for these type of vehicles, or is it just like normal cars?
No, I mean, there definitely have been people that have played around, particularly with motorcycles. In fact, somebody, I didn't talk to them today, but somebody was looking into that. So I think you'll see it to be a little bit more prevalent. I think it was pretty hard when you think originally we were using like OBD devices as an aftermarket solution, and they can be quite expensive. So it made sense. In fact, it didn't even make sense to put them in all the personal lines vehicles because the premiums were just too small in some cases to support a big extra cost. And as we've gone from that to like app solutions, it's made the technology much more affordable, and so it can apply to the mass market for personal lines auto. But that also then means it could apply to some of the other maybe less expensive things like scooter insurance for scooters or motorcycles.
Okay. So that we have like annual fluctuations in the premiums that because of all these telematics that could rise. Do you think they will trust telematic pricing, as in the customers, or especially if the customer makes no claims on the policy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's all about the transparency and what you're sharing. You're sharing with the customer, and I mean, you do need to make sure that you've got a good solution and the information you're sharing is correct. I think they won't trust it if they start to see a lot of, oh, you did A, B, and C, and they don't believe that they really did A, B, and C. So I think it's important to have a good solution. I always caution people to not be overly, try to set the thresholds at a level where you're pretty certain something happened, and not be too fine with it. I think the real issue with from the consumer perspective, and one of the things that's hurt telematics today that is going to be solved in the future isn't about that aspect of the fluctuations, but it's more that the data isn't available at point of sale in a lot of cases. So when I go to an insurance company and get into a policy, neither of us know at the beginning of the policy whether I'm a good or bad driver. In general, there are things that are being done, but in general, I go and they tell me they'll give me a 10% discount if I'm willing to be tracked. So I say, okay, that sounds great. And they tell me that after some period of time, they'll use my driving data to give me a discount between 0 and 30% as an example. And so I have to go into it not knowing what the reward is going to be. And that uncertainty has been in all the consumer surveys that I've participated in, as somebody that paid for the surveys, that was always the number one concern. And I think you'll start to see, and we're already seeing there are companies that are trying to do some try before you buy stuff to give the consumer some maybe comfort up front. We're also seeing exchanges. So we might be using, we might have our data collected for some other purpose. My car is connected. Ford is collecting data on me every time I drive, even though it's not being used for my insurance. We could leverage that data so that I could give it to the insurance company. So right up front, I would know whether I was going to get a 20% discount, a surcharge. So I think you'll see over time, you'll see the uncertainty go away. And I think that's the bigger problem in uncertainty for the consumer in it.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Jeff. I think we'll have to stop for a break, and we'll come back with our very last session before lunch. Please provide your feedback for today's session. It's in the chat. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you for staying up
Thanks.
so late. Yeah.